we've got a really great panel tonight who work for a variety of purpose-driven startups. So before we kick off, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and we'll go in alphabetical order. So Bailey, I'm going to ask you to unmute and kick us off.
Hello everyone, lovely to see you this lovely Monday evening. My name's Bailey, and my background has been working in tech, mainly fintech startups for the last 10 or so years. Worked at places like Monzo and Market Finance and Soper, places like that, in marketing and product roles, but then I did train as a software engineer and didn't end up going down that route. I'm very impressed with a lot of other people here who have. Instead, I've actually founded my own startup. So I'm the CEO of Tuco Lab. We're a fintech for good research lab. And I can tell you more about the projects that we've worked on later maybe, but we work with charities, academics and banks in order to protect vulnerable customers and use the same kind of tech that others might use for more affluent people to help those who have mental health problems or other kinds of vulnerabilities. That's a bit about me.
Thank you, Bailey. And Kavita.
Hi, my name is Kavita. I am a backend engineer. I have worked in 2 startups. I'm currently working in a startup, previously worked in a larger company. I currently work for a company called Clio, where our mission is to fight for the world's financial health. And again, like it's been about 7 months of me working in the startup. What Clio does is through a chatbot interface, it gets users to engage with their finances, be better at managing finances, but also helps them improve their financial health through giving them access to a lot of different credit products that they might not traditionally be able to access. And the other interesting thing is I've also joined the company during COVID. So hopefully that's something we get to talk about as well, because that's an interesting conversation to get onboarded onto a new company remotely, especially when it's a small company. And we've grown quite a lot during the COVID period as well. So that's another thing that hopefully we'll get to chat about.
Yeah, I think we will. Sophia.
Hello everyone, my name is Sophia and I'm a software engineer. I live and work in Dublin, Ireland. I generally work on the full stack of like software applications, and I have worked for many different organizations throughout my career for different sizes and styles, I guess, from large enterprises to like a 10 people startup. Currently, I just joined a company called Clio, which sounds like Clio, but it's spelled differently. So it's spelled with I instead of A. It's different Clio. Clio operates on the legal space and basically builds software that allows lawyers to operate their businesses and run their firms effectively, thus like making access to legal services more accessible, which is our mission. Before that, in my last job, I was working for a non-for-profit startup in a very small like organization operating on the social innovation space. Yeah, so that's a bit about me.
Thank you, Sophia. And lastly, Zaid.
Hi, everyone. My name is Zaid, and I'm definitely very excited to be here as part of this panel. I currently work at a company called Peer Here, which is, some of you might know it, it's the leading marketplace for commercial retail. I am part of the engineering team, and traditionally I've been more of a backend engineer, but more recently I've moved more into the full stack side of things. And also I manage most of the infrastructure at Peer Here. So definitely excited to hear some of the other panelists' thoughts on what COVID has brought about to our industry and some of the remote working discussions.
Thank you so much for your introductions. So we'll have a panel conversation for around an hour, and then we're going to try and keep half an hour at the end for questions from the audience as well. So if the panel kind of raises something that you're interested in, you can share your question in the chat or save it till the end. Even if you're sharing in the chat, probably want to save to the end so it doesn't get lost, but we'll make sure we hold some time back to talk about those questions. But let's jump into the panel discussion now. So I'm guessing that some of the attendees tonight might be considering working for a purpose-driven startup. With that in mind, what should people be aware of when joining a purpose-driven startup versus a more traditional company, both as an engineer and in general? And Bailey, I believe that you had some thoughts about this that you wanted to share.
Okay, I'm getting the hang of the unmuting. Thank you very much, Sophie. So I wanted to kind of kick off this discussion because I think it's a really good point, and one that I have lots of knowledge of working for startups and mainly early stage startups. And I've worked for a couple of bigger and more corporate companies, so I have a little bit of experience. So the first thing I wanted to say was, like, actually purpose-driven startup, I mean, we're going to generalize massively in this conversation, maybe because I think they come in all different shapes and sizes. And I've already said early stage as one kind of differentiator when it comes to startups versus slightly later stage startups. So for me, an early stage startup would be one that's at pre-seed or seed level. Now, that only means about where the startup is in its funding cycle. So we won't get into all of that terminology, but the difference between a company that's maybe 10 people or 20 people versus 50 people is actually huge. So that's just the first thing to say. And I'd love to hear the other panelists' kind of thoughts on that. So the things that we really need to think about, I think, are work-life balance, the kind of support you might get, particularly if you're earlier on in your career. But the kind of 4 things that I really think about when I think about working with others and joining a new startup or working with a team are people. So who are the people? Are they knowledgeable? Are they friendly? Are they supportive? When you're in a startup, especially an earlier stage startup, you're going to be hanging out with those people a lot. It's going to be like your family. So really getting to know those people and understanding, are they your kinds of people, is really, really helpful, I think. Secondly is the problem. So I wouldn't actually use the term purpose because I think it kind of gets misappropriated a lot nowadays. But actually the problem that the startup is designed to solve is really important, because if you don't believe in or get excited by the thing that the startup is trying to solve, you're probably going to struggle to get excited after 6 or 12 months. And the problem might not be about the startup's kind of core mission. It might be something like, you're helping nurseries and you know nothing about kind of childcare or nurseries, but actually the problem that the startup has is all to do with reconfiguring their backend architecture. And that's the problem that you love, and you really get, you really want to work on that problem. So the problem is what's important, I think, not necessarily the purpose. The third one is product. So again, similar to the problem, like, is there a product? How good is the product? If it's early stage and the product is still kind of being worked on, can you at least see how it's going to become a good product? In my experience, when you see a startup that's been working on something for a couple of years and the product isn't that evolved, that's a telltale sign that you need to look elsewhere. And then the fourth one is the biggest plus, I think, when it comes to startups, which is potential. So the best thing about working at a startup is that you have the potential to grow as that startup grows and to learn all the different things that will happen as that startup grows. With that potential brings downsides. It brings a lack of clear career progression often, and it also often brings quite a lot of chaos and uncertainty. So if you're not necessarily comfortable being in that kind of atmosphere, you might not want to be in at least a very early stage startup. So from my point of view, I've worked in a 9-to-5 kind of job where everyone clocked out, and I was very, very annoyed at that. I really wanted more challenge. So if you're like me and you like that kind of challenge and you don't mind the uncertainty so much, I think startups can be great. But the things to watch out for are people in the startup going to be supportive of you, particularly if you're early in your career? And are you going to be excited enough to work on this thing with these people for a good chunk of time? I think those are the kind of biggest things for me to be aware of. And the one last thing I'll say is, like, there's no stigma in my mind to working at a traditional company. You know, sometimes people want to work at startups because they're sexy, and actually often they're a better place. Bigger companies can be better places for people. It's just about how you work and what you want to learn. So don't feel like you need to be looking at these kinds of companies if it's not for you.
Thank you. That's really great. Like, thank you for your honesty, because I agree, like sometimes traditional companies can provide more structure that can be really helpful if you want to accelerate your career. But then if you're passionate about a product, then it can be great to be involved. Do any of our other panelists have something to share about this? Zaid.
I think there's something quite important that you maybe focus on startups and smaller companies, usually maybe a bit more than larger or more traditional ones when it comes to leadership. Leadership becomes way more important when you're focusing on, you know, the smaller teams and focusing on what you're trying to build. And, you know, especially if it's trying to go into an industry or trying to break grounds in areas that other people have failed or have not done so well in. And, you know, maybe in larger companies, having worked in much larger companies before in the past, even though leadership is equally important at all different levels, at startups, it's, you know, as essential as anything else, because, you know, if you're going into a battle blind, you're definitely not going to get anywhere. You need to be fully on board with, or you know, you should be on board with the leadership at all different levels. Definitely another one there.
Thank you. That's like another really interesting point. Did anyone else have anything to add? Sophia.
Yeah, I would totally echo what the previous panelist said, and I would like to add on like Bailey's point about like getting support and the type of problems that you work in startups. Like obviously that's like not one size fits all, and like there are different organizations work in multiple different ways, but in terms of how you see your career progressing, like generally startups tend to prefer more generalist people who are happy to work on different problems, that problems we might not even know are problems now at the time of hiring you. While like in more mature organizations, you'll likely be more of a specialist, like you might really like an area and you really want to dive in this particular area. Again, it's not necessarily like that this will be the case, but to my experience anyway, like in startups, you'll wear more hats, you might need to work more with the product person, maybe take on some of their tasks, maybe work a bit more with design, maybe do some design tasks if there is like resources or capacity constraints. So that might help you see the more like rounded, I guess, approach in building software end to end.
Thank you.
So yeah, so adding on to again like what Bailey was saying, I think echoing the idea of a thing to be wary of is like how much support you're getting, and startup tends to be a very catch-all phrase for like a lot of different companies, right? You can have a company like Deliveroo that probably still calls itself a startup with like a big engineering team and a big structure, and you know, having an established career ladder by the time they're at that stage, all the way up to like a company in the seed round. And the level of support that you might be able to get, especially early on in your career, will depend also on the stage that a startup is in. And that's very important to find out. Like if you want to get thrown into the deep end, and some people like getting thrown into the deep end a little bit, and they find that really accelerates their learning, then you should be seeking out smaller startups where there will be a lot more challenges, but there'll be a lot more sort of trial by fire. You'll learn by doing a lot of different things and taking on a lot of challenges. But if you want a bit more structure, you will want to start looking at startups that are a bit more developed. You know, you want to look at sort of Series B and above. And again, it's kind of going back to the point of startups are sexy, and so people kind of feel like, oh, I'm going to do it anyways. But there is such a wide range of startups in different stages, and you can still get this, you know, so-called startup experience, and still get, you know, some of the positives of being a startup, of like being very close to the product by joining a startup perhaps in a larger stage. And a good question to ask at this stage as well, it's like when you're interviewing at startups, is to be honest about it and say, do you think you can support a junior engineer if that's the stage you are at? And most of the time they'll be honest about it, and that's a good way for you to progress.
Thank you. I totally agree that it's important to be honest about what you need in your career on the stage that you're at. Reflecting on your day-to-day work, how important is the purpose or mission in the startup that you work in? And how does it influence your work life day to day? Zaid, sorry.
I can give you maybe a few examples about how we, so maybe just to put it into context, our mission at Peer here is to help anyone with an idea to be able to kind of find the space in order to actualize and build that idea. And when you take that as a mission, when you're thinking about any product that we're building or any feature we're building, that means that we have to focus on, the type of users that we have at all given times. So when it comes to, prioritizing or thinking about how we can add that value as much as possible, that comes way down or trickles down all the way from the mission down to the daily tasks or the projects that we have on a monthly or quarterly basis. So I would say it's very important. It doesn't make everything, it doesn't drive every decision, but I would say most decisions when it comes to the company objectives, the project objectives, or anything in between should be in some way or form affected or influenced by a company's mission.
That's really interesting. Does any of our panel have a different experience of this or a similar experience? Kavita.
Yeah, so but similar to what Zaid is saying. So Clear's mission is to fight for, the financial health of the people, and at least at Clio, you can really see how that permeates every aspect of the culture, but also in terms of who we attract. Most of the people at Clio join, and this goes back to what Bailey was saying, it's kind of the problem. You need to be attracted to the problem as well. And a lot of the people that join Clio join it because they believe in that mission. And as to kind of a day-to-day example of how it plays into the work we do, yes, it's similar to Zaid was saying, we think about that in the objectives that we create, the OKRs that we create for ourselves, but also, even in every product decision that we make. An example is, at the moment, one of the things that we're building is a credit builder card, which allows users to improve their credit by spending on a card, which they have to top up money on. So it acts like a credit card, but it effectively is a debit card. And, one of the big discussions we've had around that has all been around how can we make sure users don't get penalized if they miss a payment, if they do something, because again, it's all about making sure that we help the user. And even if it takes us a bit more time to think about some of the things that we're doing, we are laser focused on the mission. And we know that if we lose sight of the mission, that means we lose sight of kind of the North Star that guides the company. And so, yeah, it definitely is a big part of the company culture.
Yeah, I agree with you. So the Clio that I work in is the same Clio that Kavita works at, not the legal platform Clio. It is quite confusing. But actually, it's interesting because we refocused our mission a few months ago. And in my experience, I think that's given us an extra drive towards that mission. And I think it's started to play a much bigger part in our decision-making process. Sophia, I think you have something to add.
Yes, so I generally have very similar experiences about tying the tasks and what we do every day to a larger goal. And that should be, I guess, kind of fun, and through all of the stages from the leadership to the teams that implement and operate the products. One thing that I thought was interesting when I joined much smaller startups that didn't have as mature processes as a larger organization would have was how we started introducing those processes based on impact that we had on our customers. For example, something we did caused an outage, and we're okay, this causes impact to our customers, so therefore we need to add process, which nobody really likes process, but at the same time, when you join a startup, you kind of start appreciating more what their value is. And I think this was like something interesting I learned on like introducing like better ways of working to ensure like better delivery and like better input, better like feedback flow from their customers, and how to incorporate it, all of it, in our plan and our way of operating as a team.
That's so interesting. So being purpose-driven has helped you keep that focus and change the way you work day to day because you care about the impact on your customers. Yeah, it's really nice to hear. One of the things we've already touched on a little bit is the different types of opportunities that purpose-driven companies or startups can provide versus a more traditional or more established company. And obviously there are some benefits to joining more established and traditional companies. But do you think there are any risks being in a company that isn't purpose-driven? Is there anything that you think you might be thinking about a little bit in that situation?
I'm sorry, I don't have a raise hand button and I'm probably being super thick. I think these are really interesting points around kind of how purpose permeates organizations, and I love the idea that these companies that you guys work for have such strong missions and beat the drum so loudly that it's something you're kind of talking about in this space. I just want to challenge it slightly, I think, just because I think actually if you work at a good company, all companies, all businesses at their heart must have a purpose. And most companies, like obviously there are companies where you can have a strong argument about their ethical practices, but most companies do serve customers and exist to serve customers. That's like what companies are for. So my challenge to it really is actually, I think it's possible to find all kinds of really meaningful work across loads of different types of businesses. And it's really about then how well the business is doing at like adhering to their mission. So, you know, you might not think of Amazon, for example, as a mission-driven startup. It's certainly not a startup anymore for starters, but I would definitely say they have a very strong mission. Their mission is not about social good, it's not about impact, it's not about ethics at all, but it is very mission driven in terms of actually delivering a convenient and value to consumers. And they've been incredibly successful at that, right? So I think it's possible to find purpose in all kinds of different places. And from my perspective, the thing to kind of do a bit of soul searching about, and this is across your whole career. I don't think this is like just about one job, but it's kind of what are the purposes and the problems and the missions that you yourself want to contribute to over the course of your life. I know that sounds really massive and scary, but actually, as I said before, I don't think it necessarily has to be about the end product. It can be about, I really want to learn about open banking as an example that I've used, something that I believe should be used for good. I want to contribute to that conversation. How am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to join a startup like Clio or Tuco. But it may be all kinds of different motivations. So yeah, I think there are certainly companies out there that have dodgy missions and dodgy ways of doing things, but on the whole, I'm an optimist. I think most companies are doing a good job, especially when they're like growing and delivering things for customers. So yeah, that's just an alternative viewpoint, really.
And it's good to hear an alternative. So we've had a challenge from Bailey. Missions can come from virtually any type of company, and any type of company can be mission or purpose driven, not necessarily in this kind of doing good mission, but still have a mission. Do any of our panelists have anything that chimes with that, or a challenge back? Sophia.
Oh yeah, I muted. I definitely agree with, like, there's all companies have a reason for existing to begin with. And for me, like, the way I understand purpose is more of like, I guess, the purpose, that how it resonates with you. And therefore, like, if something is important to me, and similarly to what Bailey said, like I want to invest my career working in it. And I found, especially the last year, because there's not a huge amount of things going on in my life in general, because like I can rarely leave my house, like having some sort of connection and working for something that I actually think is important was definitely something that kept me going, especially last year before we kind of got used to this whole like madness. And even working in like some organizations did COVID responses, some organizations like addressed differently, like what was the impact of the situation to their employees, their communities, how it impacted their purpose essentially, or maybe grew their purpose. So yeah, I find that personally for me, if I work for something that I don't really care about, like it would kill my creativity and my joy of like contributing to my work every day.
Yeah, I hear you, and how important it is to have that driver when times are a bit strange and maybe we're lacking in other areas of our life. Yeah, I found that useful over the last year too. Kavita.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I actually agree with Bailey. I think the difference of how I understood it is, to me, it's like, you know, a non-purpose driven company isn't really a company with a dodgy mission, but rather a company that doesn't really know what it's doing, where it doesn't, you know, the leadership doesn't really have like any focused idea of what the next 5 years, the next 3 years looks like for the company. And, you know, in that sense, I think different companies have different missions. Some of them will be noble, whether they mean it or not. Some of them will be dodgy and they might be very explicit about it. And like I think everyone has said so far, it's all about finding the alignment. I think purpose can be a bit of a fuzzy word, but really it boils down to like what gets you out of bed every morning, like whether that's the product that you're building, like what are the questions that you are excited to solve, and that gets you coming to work and feeling excited about the work that you're doing. And I think the risk, going back to what you were saying, Sophie, the risk of not working in a company like that, which doesn't really have a mission of any sort or have any challenge in that which resonates with you, is that it gets a little bit soul sucking. Like my first job was at a large company where they didn't really have like a focused mission. It all felt very scattered. It didn't feel like they knew where they were going. And I think in those companies, you feel the effect, even in a large company, the effect when leadership doesn't have like a cohesive view of what they want to do. It trickles down in the day-to-day work of people. If you don't understand like what you're working towards, it's very hard to fit all the small pieces of the bits of work you're doing together to align with what the company's doing. And I think that effect can be felt.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting, that if you lack in that leadership, it can be difficult to connect with your day-to-day job, and how important it is to have that leadership. Bailey.
Yeah, I was just going to add to Kavita's point, because I think she's totally right. I think it can be hard, I think, for people coming into the industry, knowing how do you find out if the leadership is chaotic, and like, how do I see a good job versus a bad job? And yeah, I think that would be a good thing to go, you know, if people have thoughts on that. Me personally, I would say trust your gut, because even if you don't have that much experience in the industry, I think a lot of the time you'll be able to tell if people are kind of bullshitting or don't really believe in what they're saying. And then the second thing to remember, I would always say, every single person here is going to be super valuable to these companies. They should be selling to you. So it should definitely be up to the founder in a smaller startup or a manager in a bigger startup to sit down with you and really sell the opportunity, sell the mission. So hopefully from that, you'll be able to discern whether or not it's chaotic or not. But yeah, I suppose the third thing to say is, do leave if you're having a terrible time. You know, I think like there's so many great jobs in the tech industry that don't stay somewhere forever if you're miserable. I've left places after 3 months.
Yeah, it's true that like cool and trendy, or, you know, a great idea doesn't necessarily translate into a good experience day to day. And that actually leads me on to my next question quite nicely, because we might be slightly biased, as Bailey's already touched on. We've all chosen to work for startups with a purpose, normally a kind of a do good in the world type purpose. But being honest, what are some of the frustrations you've experienced working for a purpose-driven startup? And if you managed to address these, how did you do that? Zaid.
I think hiring is always going to be a theme here. It's always going to be a tricky one, no matter what type of company you're in. The only key difference here is hiring becomes a bit more selective and a bit more difficult when you're in a smaller environment that is focused on, let's say one mission, laser focused on one specific goal or a set of goals. And it's not to say, you can't find good, smart people in the industry. It's more about how do you make sure you're finding the right people? And that's always going to be difficult in tech, but equally becomes more and more now in this case.
Thank you for sharing. Does anyone else have any frustrations? Bailey.
Yeah, so again, this comes back to the definition of purpose-driven startup and different types and early stage versus late stage. But certainly if you're going to work for the kind of very kind of social impact led smaller company that I'm doing at Tuco, you may have to think about things around pay. So, we've been lucky at Tuco in that we've been able to get grant money that has meant that we've mainly been able to keep up with market rate, but we're certainly not going to be able to offer you the amounts that you might get at, we talked about Deliveroo or Clio, kind of places with lots and lots of venture capital money, which is very nice to have. So one thing that you might want to think about is that a priority? Do you really want to work towards getting a lot of money? And that, if so, that's great, and I would prioritize that. The other thing is flexibility. So again, smaller organization, and I'm massively generalizing, I think, but smaller organizations and social impact organizations probably have thought a little bit more about flexibility than, say, your Series B VC funded startup. And so, for example, at Tuco, we have people who work different hours and have caring responsibilities they work around, all that kind of thing. So that's something that we're really supportive of because that's part of our mission. But it may be that because you're kind of on a track in a bigger company or a later stage company, they want you to be there for certain things and certain meetings, and it's important for your career to do that. So these are just some of the differences. It's not necessarily good or bad, I think. It's just stuff to bear in mind.
Yeah, thank you. That is true, that sometimes for some types of startup or company, pay can be more limited. I think that's particularly true in the charity sector, which is the ultimate example of kind of doing good and purpose-driven work. Sophia.
Yeah, a quick point that I personally have experienced in the past was that generally resources tend to be more limited, as Bailey mentioned, money, and as also hiring, as I mentioned, but also like generally in terms of the work that needs to be done every day, there's a lot of work to be done, and that doesn't necessarily always, or it's not always easy to align with your own goals, with the organizational goals. Like there's a lot of work to be done. There's potentially not enough people to do it. So like you might need to do work that doesn't necessarily help you grow towards your goals. So that, I'm not sure if it's just a startup's problem. Like I presume that this is something you can generally like have to deal with in multiple different types of organizations. But yeah, I think with limited resources, it's kind of tricky to ensure that you're still growing while you're doing the work that you need to do. But the opposite can happen too, though. That's a caveat that you can experience super fast growth just because like you need to grow to catch up with the needs and the demands.
Yeah, that's really true. Kavita.
Yeah, I guess like on the flip side of things, yeah, one of the frustrations is things will move quickly and it can be chaotic, especially, you know, when a company is beginning to scale quickly. Like I think at Clio, we've doubled in size in the last 6 months. And while that's like very exciting for where we're headed, there are also like teething problems with going from 50 to 100 people that we do need to manage. So like, you know, things like getting better at communicating, like, you know, getting better at scaling up like progression frameworks, like bringing in processes that we didn't need as a small company that suddenly have to come in, dealing with like launching several new products because we need to raise for the next round. And it can get a little bit overwhelming, but again, it's one of those things where it's like pros and cons. You know, I like a little bit of chaos, and I think amidst all the chaos, it brings new challenges and brings new opportunities. But there are also days where you just think you just won like a normal 9 to 5. So, you know, there are days where it gets a little bit tiring and overwhelming. And I think it's just about managing that as well.
Yes, I think one of the things about being in the purpose-driven space, particularly in startup space, is you're solving these new problems that haven't been solved, and you don't have much like organizational knowledge and history. So I'm used to working in like very traditional companies, people with long service histories where they know the problem space really well. There's always someone you can go and ask. Often in this like startup space, you have to work out the solution yourself within your team. So it's a different challenge. Bailey.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that from Kavita, because I think one of the things that we don't talk about enough in the industry is burnout. So I think this isn't really just about startups. I think it probably happens in much bigger companies as well. I think one of the amazing things about startups is that it's kind of like a treadmill that you're on, and you're constantly being fed like new exciting things to work on and challenges, and you're like keeping your adrenaline up because you're working on these cool things. Hopefully that's the aim. But I definitely would say to any people out there who are earlier in their career who haven't necessarily been through that before, there are lots of signs to look out for around actually that can become too much. And I think in startups in particular, in earlier stage companies, it can be a real issue for the reasons that Sophia was touching on. You know, you kind of working on all these different things, and you don't really have the space or the air to kind of come up for breath and go, oh my gosh, I'm really stressed, I'm really burnt out, I'm really tired. So I think one thing to really think about is whether you're going on that journey on an early stage startup or a later one, you know, make sure that you have the mentorship and the peers around you, like with codebar, to kind of talk through issues that you're having at work, because it's such a big problem in the industry. I can't even begin to tell you. And I'm not trying to put you off. I'm just trying to make sure that you're aware. You know, that is a big pro, but then there is a big con in that it becomes too much. And it's no judgment on anybody. It's just about the life that startups can make you lead.
Yes, that's a really important point, and thank you for raising. And different companies will support in different ways. At Clio, we're very lucky. We have Sanctus sessions, and Sanctus are another purpose-driven startup, but they provide workplace-based counselling sessions for employees, and people find that really useful. But I'm going to move us on to something more positive. I'm really interested to hear, how does your company manifests its purpose, bring it to life? Does it come naturally, or do you think it needs some active work and promotion to keep that purpose alive? Does anyone have some thoughts on this to kick us off? Kavita.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I think part of it is a kind of, you know, loop. We hire for people that are passionate about the purpose. So naturally, people that come into the company tend to be quite motivated about, you know, improving people's financial health, kind of in the personal finance space. And those are the problems they are interested in solving. And so they make sure to raise that. But, you know, like all startups, we also try and that gets mentioned all the time, whether it's in all hands meetings, but also by staying quite connected to the user. Like, I think everyone in the company since I've been there, whether you're an engineer or a data scientist, are invited into like user research sessions where we get to speak to our users, or we get to sit in while an actual user researcher speaks to our users. We get to hear their problems. And I think for me, for example, that's been a really good way of rooting myself to the purpose of the company. Because most of our users on the US, most of them tend to have really poor finances, very low credit scores. And you kind of get on these calls and you're hearing them talk about like very valid life situations and how, you know, bad debt or some poor financial decisions they made when they were 19 or 20 has like affected them and when they're in their 40s. And I think staying in touch with the users and the kind of problems and we're trying to solve naturally means that it reminds everyone of why we are trying to solve this problem and why it's so important for the company.
Yeah, I really enjoy sitting in on those user research sessions. They're so interesting and focusing. Sophia, I know you had something to add on this point.
Yeah, I really like this question because I thought about like, I guess, how I connect to the purpose and how I like connect to why what we're doing is important and how I'm getting my kind of daily dopamine hits for that, I suppose. And in my current role, like I've had multiple opportunities to connect with our purpose. As already mentioned, like there are like opportunities to join sessions where there are customer success sessions and in this way connect with the customers. So like basically develop some empathy to their challenges. We also got some training, which was particularly tailored for our industry and customer backgrounds. So basically that helped me better understand like how they run their businesses, common challenges they face that we help them with, how we realize our mission. So basically that helped me basically understand better the problems faced. At the same time, something I thought was very interesting was to find ways to add values to the customers completely outside the product. Like, for example, my company conducts yearly research and reports on the industry trends, which are shared afterwards with the legal industry. Like especially the sales and customer success teams create relationships with our customers and basically add advocates as them, like identifying potential opportunities for them. And also the results from the surveys are shared with us in Slack channels, and like we can see their feedback on the product like on a daily basis, which is kind of like a good reminder of like who uses the product and why, and like how you can make it better for them. That's kind of the embodiment of our mission for me, how to make our customers successful on what they do.
That's so interesting. I really like the idea of having training sessions so you actively learn about the space and your customers' problems. Zaid?
So I think for us at Appear here, we've been fortunate enough to be recognized by, let's say, in the space that we operate in, by the brands that we work with. And because it's a two-sided marketplace, you know, we're very much, you know, known within the brand space or the tenant side. So, you know, whenever someone is looking for a space, naturally the name does come up. So that does help. Obviously, this is maybe a bit different than the early days when it was much harder to kind of be able to reach and to get that community exposure. But, you know, with that comes a big responsibility that we have as a company and, you know, an enterprise that does want to promote and build these ideas for entrepreneurs. So I'll give you maybe an example of recently within the pandemic. A big part of our community has suffered when the shops had to close. And this is, you know, a direct impact of the pandemic. But at the same time, people's behaviors at the beginning of the pandemic were a bit more risk averse. People did not want to, you know, even go to the shop in their neighborhoods. But then, you know, soon after that, human nature and behavior quickly adapts, and you do realize people do want to be in the streets, and people do want to get their kind of dose of the, you know, the coffee shop that they are very much a part of, the independence around the corner, and everything within that space. And as our responsibility, we did realize that, you know, a lot of these shops will keep suffering as a result in the next months and possibly year. So we came up where we built this campaign that we're currently working on called Save the Streets, which is aiming to kind of get more government exposure around these independents and retailers that have not received the direct, let's say, help and impact from, let's say, other businesses such as F&B specifically. So we try to do what we can in the space that we have. And sometimes it's through the campaigns, sometimes it's through, you know, competitions that we've had. We used to have a yearly competition, which we still do, but, you know, with COVID, things got impacted, which we used to call Space for Ideas, where, you know, people would apply to win a free shop for about 6 weeks. And some of these categories were, you know, basically for good companies or for good ideas. So yeah, something around that space.
That's so interesting. And yeah, I imagine Appear Here was pretty badly impacted by COVID. Just, I can see that Bailey has her hand raised, but just before moving on to Bailey, I wonder if you can tell us quickly, Zaid, like, how did the pandemic affect how you felt about Appear Here's mission? Did it make you feel more connected or less?
So, sorry, it cut off slightly.
Oh, okay. I was wondering, how did the pandemic make you feel about Appear Here's mission? Did it make you feel more connected or less?
Absolutely, that's a great question. With the I guess the or maybe let's go back to why I joined the company. You know, or one of the main reasons I did join the company is I completely and fully believe in retail as an opportunity to, you know, add flavor and value to the culture and to the street, to your experience as someone that lives in maybe a very diverse city such as London. And when you add retail that is more experiential, that is more kind of targeted, and you know what they're selling at the place, who's selling it, why they're selling it, you know, that adds much more value to me than the big box retailers, you know, for example, in my case. With the pandemic, the main thing that has changed as a result of that is that people aren't allowed to do it at certain times, depending on the lockdown tiers, for example, in the UK. In terms of my personal kind of my personal you know, attachment to the mission, it's only kind of gotten stronger as a result, because now we do realize that this is part of what makes a city. You know, this is what makes you know, the flavor of you know, the coffee store that you might really like versus the Starbucks. These are the things that really make and break your certain experience in neighborhoods, and you know, that really amplified as a result of COVID, if anything.
Thank you. And Bailey, thank you for your patience.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about mission. The question was about how do companies manifest them? So coming from a kind of social impact space, I think a really good thought experiment, if you're thinking about joining a company and hearing about their mission, is to imagine, what would the world be like if that mission was fulfilled? What would be different if what that company is trying to aim to do actually succeeded and there was no need for the company anymore? Because that's really what having a mission means. Now, obviously in real life, most companies that we're talking about will always be working towards that goal. But actually, the kinds of things that would need to be true for the mission to be solved are the kinds of things that that company should be investing in doing. So as an example, we at Tuco have thought about how we hire people, making sure that we're inclusive. We make sure that we have a flexible working policy because we support carers in our product. So we need to make sure that we support them when they're working for us too. We think about mental health, and we think about it in context of the statistics around how people work and the overwork that leads people to have mental health problems at work. So we try and manage that. I mean, sometimes we're not very successful, but we try. And then in our bigger mission, we don't just work on profit-making activities, we also work with charities and we work with academics so that we can make the work that we do get amplified, and hopefully big companies that have much more power than we do can actually take some of the initiatives that we're working on board and design better things for people in difficult circumstances. So I know I'm, you know, blowing my own horn, but I think that it's really important to think about all of those things that would have to be true for a mission to be fulfilled. And so I love looking at other tech companies that have that in their ethos as well, and the kinds of things that they do. For example, there's a company called Tully who deal with debt advice. They have time for their employees to spend at Citizens Advice and giving volunteering to give people in difficult circumstances advice. So there are all these amazing things that can be true when you're working for a more mission-driven startup, but that's, I think, the difference between kind of a social impact-led organisation and other ones. So yeah, 2 cents, and think about, you know, what would need to be true for it to be solved.
Yeah, that's very wise words. I think that's totally true, and it's something that we talk about day to day at Clio. Actually, is ideally Clio shouldn't have to exist, and that's quite a strange way to talk about your company. I'm used to a much more profit-driven company where you want to keep customers coming back and keep more dependency. I touched briefly earlier on the impact of the pandemic, and over the last 12 months, we've all had to adjust to remote working. Have you found it harder to stay connected to your purpose and your team while working remotely? And do you have any tips for us? Zaid.
I'm going to take some credit here, but it's probably not me. So a colleague of mine wrote this Medium post a few weeks ago, Thomas, and he basically nailed it and laid out exactly what has happened at Appear Here, at least in the product team, over the pandemic. I would definitely recommend everyone to read it. If they just do a simple search on Medium, they'll find it. Basically, we've obviously had to adapt, but the main difference here is that we've tried to retain as much of the kind of the things that we have been used to. We did some, you know, a bit of random things, some fancy dress Fridays over, you know, our weekly calls. Kavita's laughing because she was a part of that. And we did some, you know, cocktail making classes. We did some recently some mince pie making classes. You know, something to just keep a bit of that normality or the team culture alive. Because at the end of the day, you know, it's all just a bunch of these, you know, experiences that make up why you joined a certain team or why you stay in a certain team, right? So yeah, definitely read the article that's been linked in the chat, and that's it for me.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. Kavita, do you have something to add?
Yeah. So, you know, as I was saying earlier, I had the interesting experience of being onboarded remotely into company onto Clio. And, you know, as Zaid was saying, I used to work at Appear Here, which had such a strong culture, and then coming and trying to get into a company where I hadn't met anyone in person and joining remotely. I think it's always a challenge, and it's a challenge that Clio has had to deal with, given that, as I was saying, we've onboarded about half the company now remotely. But I think the more they've done it, they've definitely really managed to retain their culture even in a virtual period, which I think is testament to how strong the culture was before. Like, you know, Zaid saying, I think it's kind of trying to recreate the same like experiences that you have that you do in an office and trying to do it virtually. It's about creating these opportunities where, because obviously you're always on a Zoom call, but it's actually getting on a Zoom call to do something that's not work related. That's a challenge. I definitely felt like my first week of, you know, working remotely, I was kind of like, well, you know, I've been on a Zoom call all the time, but I haven't really had like a chance to sort of, you know, have those chats you might have like while grabbing a coffee in the office, or like when you're having lunch and someone sits next to you and you're like having a chat with someone from another team. Those things, you just have to, as a company, be a little bit more deliberate about it. You have to be more purposeful about it. You know, they just aren't going to happen. And I think, yeah, at Clio, it's, you know, Clio's done a good job of being deliberate about it. We've doing poker nights. So I've just organized a candle making session for my team, and I'm very skeptical about it, but we'll see what happens. So we're having to kind of dip into, you know, like being really creative about the things you can do, and finding ways for people to connect as people rather than just kind of, you know, colleague coming to work and doing a task. because that can feel a little bit alienating, definitely.
Candle making sounds great.
We'll have to send you a box, Sophie.
Oh my gosh, I've wanted to do it for ages.
Haley, this is the box. It's a very nice box. I'll tell you. Well, I'll let you know how the candle goes. I'll add it to the codebar update email.
Yeah, we had a team wine tasting, so we could have a chance to like have a chat and, you know, not just about work stuff, because it can get a bit work focused. Sophia.
Yeah, so I had a similar experience with Kavita, as like I was onboarded remotely in my last role. Like I don't mind the remote work. I was pretty adjusted because in my previous organization the team was distributed. So like for me, doing the catch-ups and like the work remotely was not like the issue, but the connection definitely was. And what I missed was, I guess, not my interactions necessarily with people, but how people interact with themselves. You know, when you're in the office and you see, oh, this person speaks with this person seems to be like, you know, the kind of heart of all conversations. So I kind of miss this aspect of social office life, and I kind of look forward to having the ability to do this with my colleagues. But what I did and what my colleagues I guess suggested, recommended me to do was to like deliberately reach out to people and schedule one-on-ones and then speak to them about this. Like I would discuss exactly all those things about this, because as they were working together from before, like most of them anyway, like or they weren't, they were remoted on board, or they were onboarded remotely. Okay, I found it. Onboarded remotely like me, they had a similar experience to share, and I feel like that definitely helped us connect, and it helped me feel more comfortable. And then in terms of the actual mission, I noticed that sharing customer support stories or like having regular all hands where we all get updates of like where we're heading, like it was useful for me to stay connected to the purpose itself rather than my colleagues. So yeah, overall, like I feel it takes a bit more effort to be deliberate about scheduling all that stuff and sticking with it and prioritizing it despite the work that you have to do. But I think it really pays off in terms of the long-term connection with your team and the company.
Yeah, that point about making sure you're still seeing user feedback and also like actively catching up with your colleagues, totally agree with. I joined Clio 2 weeks before the first lockdown in the UK, so I had this strange like blended experience where I thought I was going to have one experience and it rapidly turned into a different one. But it's been good overall. And we're coming up to the hour that we had allotted for the panel, and we've had some great questions come up in the chat, so I want to make sure I hold back some time. So I'm going to follow on from this question with our final question, which is about culture fit. So in my experience working for a startup, and we've actually touched on this already, means often you're working in a smaller, fast moving team than if you've joined a bigger company. And because of this, culture is always a huge part of working for a startup. What does culture fit mean to each of our panelists? Zaid, kick us off again.
I think, at least to me personally, culture or a culture fit is quite intangible, right? You can't really define it. What you can define is, let's say, company values or team values. And that's a way to make sure that people either, feel that they belong to those values or feel that they can be working towards them and building a product that believes in such things, or not. And I think that's the easiest way to think about culture, because it's quite easy and sometimes it's just a buzzword to start talking about these things. And a lot of companies keep mentioning it as part of their hiring process, but unfortunately it's very difficult to manifest it, right? Like it's one of those areas that could also push people away from it, because how do you make sure that you're a culture fit? What you can do is improve the experience of, let's say, a potential candidate or someone from the outside by just showing examples of how these values have manifested.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question. Can you name some of the Appear Here values?
Yeah, I think my favorite one is just the no bullshit value, which is, you know, as it says on the tin, right? There's something you need to say it. Obviously, you know, there's a difference between constructive feedback and just saying something to hurt someone's feelings. So, you know, there's something that needs to be said.
That is quite a value. Bailey.
I'm going to try not to give too much of an essay for this answer. So I believe culture fit is a myth and a dangerous myth. I'm going to summarize a long argument in tech that is still ongoing by saying that in some startups and in some versions of startup history, very early stage teams have said that it's great, we just hire people just like us, and we hire our friends, and they're the best people to hire because we know them, and we're just going to be super productive together. And the best example of that is the PayPal mafia. If you want to read about it, you can read it in 0 to 1, which is by Peter Thiel. And a lot of startups kind of followed that mold for a long time, and still do. Like if you are invited for a culture fit interview and kind of given a teed up thing of like, we look for people with these values, then that's probably what they're looking for. And then there's another train of thought, there's another kind of camp that is my camp, where actually if you hire people who are just like you, particularly when you're a small team, then what you're going to end up with is stuff that isn't very well thought through, isn't well challenged. You're going to have quite an exclusive culture. You're not going to be able to kind of welcome people and make people feel comfortable from different backgrounds. And the kinds of things that will happen early stage when you're at a company of 10 people, all white guys, for example, will then become a rolling thing. And in 20, 30, 40 people and 100 people, you'll kind of get to see that play out. And I've seen that myself, and it's heartbreaking. And it's not just white guys. I just want to say, like, we at Tuco have 3 co-founders who are white women, right? We have different backgrounds, but we made a conscious effort to make sure that we were inclusive and hired people from different backgrounds when we hired. So my approach to culture fit is a simple one, I suppose. If you're interviewing at a company, have your gut instinct ready and make sure that you feel comfortable with the people that you're interviewing with, who hopefully you'll be working with. Like, make sure you interview with the people you'll be working with, because you need to just get on with them. You need to be able to be honest with them, and you need to kind of have that bullshit filter. But I would very much see it as that, and not worry too much about, oh, I need to be a culture fit. I think that's a bit of bullshit. But that's me. Done. Essay done.
I'm going to ask a sneaky follow-up. But what do you make of the phrase culture add rather than culture fit, if you come across it?
Yeah, and I think people have good intentions. I've seen a couple of ex-colleagues who've started businesses who use that kind of phrase. And I think, you know, to be fair, I kind of do that. Like, I've been thinking when we've hired, oh, we really need, and it's not just about someone's background, actually, it's about their approach, right? We had 2 engineers in our engineering team, as well as our CTO. One who was a generalist and really open-minded and just positivity pouring out of him, and the other guy who was super skeptical and loved going really deep into problems. It was great to have 2 people with those different perspectives. So I suppose that is culture add, and therefore I'm in that camp. But yeah, I think as an interviewee for people who are looking to join the industry, I would just advocate feeling comfortable, like, yeah, to people go out their way to make sure that you are accommodated. That's my thing.
Thank you. And finally, Kavita.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Bailey said a lot of the stuff that I wanted to say. Like, I had written down here, you know, culture fit tends to be a code word for people to hire other people that look like them and have the same experiences as them, which, you know, as we all know, has kind of led to a lack of diversity in tech. And I think, yeah, going to what Sophie was saying, at least at Clear, we're starting to move more towards, you know, culture add and thinking less in these culture for interviews, thinking less about, you know, are you like everyone else who works here, but more about like, what can someone add to the culture of Clear? You know, what unique experiences and perspectives are they going to be bringing to the table? And that's important, especially for a small company. But I think another thing to iterate, especially to like, you know, if you're early on in your career, thinking about joining a startup, is that culture isn't just one way. It isn't just the company trying to look at you and say, are you good for us? It's you also doing that and seeing if you will fit in the company and if you like the way they work. And it's a hard one to answer during COVID, especially like when you don't get to get onto the office, you don't get to meet people face to face, you don't get to really interact with the people that you're going to be working with. And I think the one way to kind of do that, you know, if you're trying to assess whether you will enjoy working at a company, is to try and meet as many people as you can, even if it's a remote interview. So some companies do facilitate that, like at Clear, for example. I know Pia here as well, for example, like you do get to meet like quite a significant amount of the team during the interview process. But if that isn't built into the startup or the company they're interviewing in, actually, even if it's a larger company, try and ask for more time with the developers or the team that you might be joining, or, you know, someone else in a different part of the company that you think might be able to give a unique perspective. Like chat to people in the company and try and get an idea of that, because it kind of comes down to that, right? Like startup life is challenging, things are hard, but if you don't like going to work, you don't like the people that you're working with, then it's going to be a pretty miserable time.
Yeah, that's very true. And Sophia, I can see you've sneaked in, so I'm going to give you the closing remarks on this question.
Yeah, I'm not going to add much more on like the culture. I guess on the subject of culture, I feel like it was covered pretty well. The only thing I wanted to add at this stage is that when I started looking for my first job, none of this was particularly clear to me. So first of all, it's great that like you like are interested and are here and listening about all of those subjects. But at the same time, like if you're not able to, if you go to an interview and you're not like 100% sure, like, oh, is this purpose resonates with me, or is this culture going to be good for me? This is totally fine. Like, and it definitely becomes so much easier after you join a couple of places and you leave a couple of places. So don't be afraid to experiment with different types of organizations. Go interview, and interviewing and not taking the job like is actually a great thing. Like I just love interviewing because you get to meet so many different people from different places that it helps you build the point of reference to understand and compare. Oh, these people treated me like this. These people like treated me differently, and I like the way these people treated me. And these people speak with more passion, or these people like you get so much more exposure to that can help you build up this intuition that, oh, this culture is going to be great for me. Like I think I developed it very well, like many years in my career. So I would basically encourage everybody to try, and like I think this will come naturally at some stage, and you will know what's good for you. But maybe it's fine if like you don't know from the beginning. Some people know, some people don't. I didn't know for a lot of years in my career.
Thank you for being so honest. And I'm actually going to wrap up by saying I think culture is something that can change, particularly in a startup. And actually, when I first joined Clio, I wasn't 100% convinced that the culture was going to be a good fit for me, but I really did believe in their mission and the product. So I thought I'll give it a try. And a year on, I would say I'm much, much happier. And I think I've seen the culture change over that year. So nothing is set in stone. We're going to wrap up the kind of more conversational part of the session now. Thank you for sharing so honestly to all the panelists, but we're going to move on to a Q&A from the audience. Now, I've got a few questions that were asked in advance, and I've also seen some come up in the chat. But there was one I wanted to start with, and I probably should have made time to get to it first, but Taps has asked, how do you define a startup company? I'm wondering if one of the panelists would be comfortable to give us a brief definition of a startup. Yeah, Bailey, I think you're best placed.
Oh God, you asked for a brief one though. So I would define a startup as two things, but this is my own definition, like everyone will have a different definition. And then I can do a slightly longer thing if you want me to, otherwise I'll do it on Twitter. So I would say, number one, it's an experiment. Startup is a company that isn't yet proven in terms of how it's going to make money and be sustainable in the long term. So it's an experiment. And that can be a very small company, like 5 people. It could be 100 people. But the kind of more complicated answer that I won't give now is that it's an experiment, and someone or somehow they're funding that experiment while they're still an experiment. And because it's an experiment, you have to kind of expect a little bit of uncertainty, a little bit of chaos. So that's number one about startups. Number two about startups, for me personally, I would define any company that doesn't give out share options as not a startup. So I believe the benefit for us as employees, or me as an employer when I'm thinking of hiring people, in terms of startups, is that you're getting a piece of the pie earlier on, and that's a really important part of it. Like, so that's something that we won't have time to touch on in detail here, but share options as part of your benefits package is also something I would say. So for me, if the company is like proven out, if it's got lots of profit every year, and you're not getting share options as part of your package, you're not joining a startup. And that's fine, but that's not a startup. How's that?
I think that makes sense to me. Perhaps if you have any further questions, you can pop them in the chat box or raise your hand. Yeah, so if you have a question you want to ask and you're comfortable to ask it on like through the audio and video, you can use the raise hand feature to let me know. It's in the reactions tab on Zoom, or you can pop it in the chat. I'm going to keep an eye on time, but I'll try to get to the questions that I think would be interesting to most of the audience. And that brings me to Jennifer S. has asked, how do you get your foot in the door at a tech or startup company, like an internship or a junior developer role? She's been trying LinkedIn and connecting with people on there, but given the current economy, how do you set yourself apart and get a step ahead? Do any of the panelists have some insight here? Zaid.
I think it depends obviously on the type of role you're trying to get, if it's engineering focused, non-engineering, marketing, finance, etc. If it is engineering, I think the best thing to do is just to keep practicing. You know, you can basically learn anything online for free these days. So you don't have a lack of resources. Just thinking about when I was doing this, you know, at the beginning of my career, the best thing that I did, or I was lucky enough to have someone to guide me through it. So I found a mentor who was able to, you know, maybe help me with some applications, interview prep, even just, you know, solving some coding katas. Anything that is basically helping you improve is a step to the right direction. One other thing is not to kind of lose focus on a few different things, because on the entry level, you don't want to be going into, you know, 5 different technologies or languages. You want to try to focus on 1, 2 max, and try to get as proficient as possible in them, so that you can, you know, distinguish yourself from other applicants. Another thing is, you know, make a presence online by having a blog, or, you know, writing certain things that you find interesting, things that you learned. Distinguish yourself from other candidates. We're hiring now, so this is one thing that we always look at whenever we're looking at these, you know, new CVs or new applications is, you know, what is distinguishing this person versus the other 50 or the other 100? And the first thing that comes to mind is either their presence, their GitHub, their websites, projects, personal projects. What do they find interesting outside the workplace as well when it comes to technology? So, you know, just being well-rounded really helps in this area.
I think that's really good advice. I myself have a blog, and I had a blog when I was looking for my first job, and it's a great opportunity to show potential employers who you are and what you're interested in before they've even met you. Sophia.
I think all points mentioned by Zaid were like great points. Definitely focusing on how to differentiate yourself is like something that it's important to do, especially because like it's really competitive now. From my understanding, anyway, from the landscape, like it seems that like there are jobs, but at the same time, it's very competitive to get the attention. Like definitely get your resume reviewed, improve it, like do a lot of learning to almost sell yourself and your accomplishments. Might sound like bragging, but I don't mean bragging. I mean like really you're almost like a product that you need to sell for companies to want to work with you. Like, and I found people can get really creative with that. I once interviewed somebody who told me, who basically showed me an MVP version of our product that this person had built on their spare time. And this showed to me, oh wow, like this person actually took time, understood what we do, tried to build a mock of it. Like this person is like pretty amazing, so they need to be, or even like have some potential thoughts about the product, how to improve the product. They don't necessarily have to be great thoughts or like they don't necessarily have to be amazing ideas. Just something to show, especially in a startup context. I feel it's very important to see that you care about the product and that you have some thoughts and want to work towards this mission. So I think this could definitely help in setting you apart and showing to the person that interviews you that like I'm thinking about this problem space, I like it and I want to contribute to it.
That's amazing, building a mini app to demonstrate. That's very impressive. Kavita.
Yeah, just to add quickly, the one thing is just apply. Just apply, even if you don't hit 100% of the requirements that you might see on a job description. Apply anyways. I've definitely, from my experience with codebar, I definitely think people don't apply enough. Everyone seems to be like waiting for the magical moment when they'll be absolutely ready to apply, and that's not true. Just apply. Startups don't always advertise roles immediately. Like for example, at Clio, I know we weren't looking for a junior dev, but if a junior developer applied for one of the other positions we had, they would be like added to the list that we had. And once we opened junior roles, they were the people that were notified first. So that could be the case for a lot of startups. They might not explicitly advertise junior roles, but it might happen that you start that sort of relationship with them by applying and start the relationship with the recruitment person they might have. And that means that you're more privy to information when they actually do have positions available for you, if they don't already.
Yeah, I'll follow up with this because I've had several people message me on LinkedIn that I haven't previously connected with because they're interested in working at Clio, and it impresses me that they're prepared to reach out and express that interest, and I will then happily pass their details along to our hiring representative, and they are usually more than happy to have a chat and find out a bit more about that candidate, even if we're not actively hiring. So I definitely agree with Kavita. Take that first step. Even if you don't feel ready, the worst thing that can happen is they will say no. That's it. And we all experience rejection. So go for it. And we've had a question to follow up from that. It's specifically for Zaid, but other people might have mentors on the panel. Zaid, how did you find your mentor?
So I was lucky to know someone that was in the industry beforehand, or at least years more experience than I was, and I just plainly asked them if they were willing to, give up a few hours every month or a few hours, or on an ad hoc basis if they're willing to do that. But I've heard of different schemes. I can't remember the name of a website that basically sets you up with mentors. I can look it up and maybe share it or circulate it with you, Sophie. So if you want to send it to the attendees. But yeah, that's one way. The other way is you can basically just do the LinkedIn approach where you send someone an email and see if they send them a message and see if they're willing to jump on a 15-minute call, and things might progress from there.
Thank you. We also had a few questions that came in before the session. This is kind of related. This question is there an in-demand technology stack for creating apps at the moment, e.g. Mongo, Express, React, Node, or something equivalent, something new students could focus their study on? Thanks. So how do we feel about focusing on a particular tech stack versus trying to be more generalist, perhaps? Kavita. Sorry.
Sorry. I mean, God, tech stacks change. Like, you know, Rails was incredibly popular 5 years ago, which is why you have a lot of startups doing Rails. Go seems to be the big, like, sexy technology now. I think that's going to be the industry, right? Technology stacks tend to change. The only thing you can do as a student is, yeah, maybe pick one, but the thing that you're really learning while learning that language isn't really the language itself, but the kind of process of learning the language, the fundamentals behind the language. And I think, like, I did Makers Academy, and that's definitely a thing that they really emphasized, because I learned Ruby in it, but I spent like a year and a half doing a completely different language. And I know a lot of other people who did Makers went on to do completely different language and tech stacks to what they learned. And so I think the moral of the story is pick a language to learn, but don't feel like that defines you and that restricts you to the kind of jobs that you apply to. The language is almost like a vehicle, and most startups acknowledge that. Most startups kind of look at it and go, it's not just about someone, we're not just hiring a Node developer or a JavaScript developer, especially at a junior level. You know, they care less about exactly what language you're using and more about how you've learned something, how much time you spend learning it, how much interest you have in learning a different technology and different languages.
Thank you, Zaid.
Completely agree with Kavita. I think a few things also to throw in there would be stay away from all those articles that say X is dying or X is the new thing, or, you know, I don't know, JavaScript is only React, stay away from Angular. This is all just, you know, SEO heavy buzzwords that go into these blogs. Just ignore it. What you can do is you can find, let's say, if there's a specific company or industry that you're very kind of interested in, maybe start researching what type of tools and technologies they use. There's a website called StackShare, which some companies share what they use, what they work on, what the different teams as well work on. So if that's kind of an area that you're interested in going in, and I mentioned this with a specific example with data science, you know, let's say data science is very heavy on Python or R or some of those tools. If you want to go into that, it would be wise maybe to learn Python. But if you're going into, let's say, only front-end development, just pick up one of the JavaScript frameworks. And the same applies for backend technologies. You know, just pick one, stick with it, pick up the skills that are language agnostic, and then you can basically learn whatever you want when the time is right. But yeah, like overthinking it is probably not the right thing to do. Just, you know, stick your guns to one area.
Thank you. We're at 8 o'clock, but we have a couple of other good questions. So is everyone all right to continue for a few more minutes? Yeah, thank you. So one of the questions that came in before was, how are the work hours or demands of working a startup fees versus a more traditional company? Sophia.
Yeah, I've had a couple of different experiences around this, and I would definitely believe that there's no one size fits all. Like, generally speaking, capacity restrictions basically are larger in startups, so there tends to be less work-life balance. At the same time, I wouldn't necessarily take this as at face value, because from my experience, there's always more work to be done, but there are people to do the work. So it's more of almost a values question and leadership question rather than an actual like startup versus like big organization. Like, you can be in a big organization and still like not have good work-life balance. So I wouldn't necessarily think that one or the other means like necessarily good or bad work-life balance. But what I would encourage everyone to do is to be upfront and ask for it during the interview process. And if you can either be like fully transparent and say, I would like to ask what's your approach in work-life balance, like what's your expectations for each role, for a junior engineer, for a medium engineer, for as you progress, so that you see the response. Because in the end of the day, that it's not really, I guess, helpful. Like, it's not going to do anybody any like service if you're hired and then you just don't want to do what they're expecting you to do. So it's good to have this conversation, or even try to ask like more conversations around how they do planning, where timelines, deadlines come from. Like this type of questions will probably help you understand like how the company thinks about shipping. So other things to potentially ask is how they deal with people, like mental health, especially in COVID time. I think it's a good question. Like I always ask how they support the people. Yeah, I definitely have seen startups with like reasonable work-life balance. So I wouldn't be put off just because of this. I think it's more of like a question of how the leadership cares about their employees and how they also want them to be retained and like motivated for the long run.
Thank you. And I think we've got 2 more questions that I'd like to ask. So hopefully the first is a quick one. So I think this is more aimed at Cleo, so possibly for Kavita. Can imagine fintech involves lots of data. Do startups have opportunities for junior data scientists, or should I look for more established companies?
Yeah, again, I think it's not one size fits all, right? Like there's so many different startups at very different stages. I can speak, if I were to speak specifically for Clio, I would say 1 month ago, we probably weren't going to hire junior data scientists, but as we've got more senior data scientists and data analysts and the data team has grown, we are probably in a better position to support more junior data scientists. But I think if your question is, do startups in general hire junior data scientists? Again, that's going to really depend on the startup. And also for yourself, the question you should be asking yourself is less, is the startup going to hire me, and more, can I grow and get the support I need as a junior data scientist at a company? And there are, there are different ways to kind of ask the questions to figure out if that company is the right fit for you. In that is figuring out how big the data team is, will you get the support that you want? Getting in touch with a data scientist, ideally in the company itself, to get answers to that. They might also be able to answer, like let you know what the hiring plan for the company is. They might be able to tell you, maybe not now, maybe in 6 months. So yeah, I don't think it's a one size fits all. I would say reach out to the companies that you're interested in, and figure out what their hiring needs are.
Thank you. And just one last question, because I think it's quite interesting. It's aimed at Clio, but I think it's potentially interesting for any more like social purpose-driven company, which is that Clio seems like it's a great company with a great purpose. It also seems like it's scaling massively. What's the business model? And that's from Leare. I hope I'm pronouncing that wrong. I apologize profusely if I'm not. Yeah, so what is Clio's business model? How do we make money?
So you're right. In the UK, we don't actually have a premium model, but Clio's 95% of Clio's users, I think that number might be higher, are actually in the US, and we offer both free product and a paid product. And I think Clio's ethos is that we will always have the free product, because we can't claim to be fixing people's financial health and we then slap a premium on that. So the free product is the core product, and we also have a subscription model, which tends to encompass different credit products. At the moment, if you pay for a monthly subscription, you get access to a loan, a small loan, a credit score, cashback. The idea is that we'll be able to expand the number of credit products we'll offer within that subscription fee, because again, like one of Clear's missions is to serve a lot of its users, which tend to be people with low credit scores in the US, and they don't usually get served by the traditional like credit facilities and credit products they have in like big banks. So the idea is that, like as I was saying, credit builder card, installment loans and things like that. But that's Clio's business model effectively.
Thank you. And Bailey.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think more generally, if you're interviewing at a place and they say, do you have any questions for us? Like, it's a great question to ask. Say, I'm really interested to find out more about your business model. Can you tell me how you expect to make money and at what stage you might expect to make money? Traditionally, startups tend to plan to lose money for a long time until they achieve massive scale, and then with lots of scale means that they have potentially, they can make a small amount of money with lots of people. But with the pandemic, profitability is definitely becoming more important. So that will trickle down, and it's probably important for you, if you're joining a startup, to have a good idea of whether or not the startup is viable for the next couple of years. So have a chat to them, ask the question, and if nothing else, they'll be really impressed that you're interested. So yeah, I think it's a really good one.
Thank you. And I think that is us. So once again, I'm going to say thank you very much to all of the panelists and everyone who's come along as well to listen to the discussion and ask questions. And thank you, panelists, for giving up your evening and sharing your experience with us. I've found it really interesting. So I hope it's been interesting to others as well.